Well, thank you very much for inviting me. I will start speaking while you set up my PowerPoint, I guess. Thank you very much. And I will not be speaking about Brexit at all, but you cannot speak on a day like today without speaking about Brexit. So I must start by saying something about Brexit. As you all know, today, or this week, let's say, is again the week where we think we might know what's going to happen after the 29th of March. So today, the UK Parliament will vote on the deal, withdrawal agreement. If they reject it, tomorrow they will vote whether they could accept a no deal, and the day after they will vote on possibly an extension of Article 50, so an extension of the period of negotiation for what is what the situation will be after Brexit Day. So the link to my talk is not so much direct but indirect, and that is the slogan of the Brexit campaign, or the Vote Leave campaign, was "Take back control," and that is what I will be talking about. I will be talking about control via the European Union and what the UK citizens lose when they leave the European Union, but focused on the European Union. So despite the fact that the European Union has increased its powers in external relations with every treaty amendment, including in 2009, the question of external relations was largely absent in the Brexit campaign. The focus was very much on sovereignty, as in having the last word, having the power to determine what's going to happen on the UK territory. And why was that the case? Why, in a world where the European Union has more powers than ever, in a globalizing world where actually international powers are more important than ever, and in a situation where the European Union restricts the powers of the member states when they act as international actors more stringently than ever, why were the external relations of the European Union, why was it so prominently absent? And I stand here today to convince you that external relations is actually, despite their conspicuous absence in the Brexit campaign, very important for the current state of the European Union, the current democratic crisis. And, you know, I'm happy to discuss what exactly the democratic crisis is. But I should say that in my reading, Brexit is really an emanation of this and one of the clearest signs of this democratic crisis. So I will argue that the EU holds in its external relations great potential and great risk, or, as I put it in my title, chances and challenges. In other words, the particularities of the EU's external relations are that it has the power to connect to people in a particular way and a possibility to demonstrate why you would want EU membership. What is the added value of the European Union? But at the same time, as long as citizens don't see that, it also has the potential to become toxic. Or to put it differently again, EU external actions can both address and worsen the current democratic crisis. Well, when the Union and the member states act internationally, power shifts and struggles occur. And these power shifts are very complex, and arguably they are more complex than when the European Union acts internally. And I will give you some explanations of that. But that is one of the first explanations why Brexit was so absent in the Brexit campaign, because it is highly complex, difficult to grasp, and simply doesn't lend itself very much for superficial political exploitation. However, as I will conclude at the end of this lecture, justifying these powers, the Union's powers in representing citizens internationally, and explicating the empowerment of Union citizens in external relations is essential for addressing this democratic crisis. And I would also argue that Brexit should trigger some reflection in that regard. So it's not so much about, is the UK in or out, or what shall we do with the UK in the future, what should be the relationship with the UK from a European perspective, but much more about the question, what does Brexit tell us? So what does it show about the failure of elites to actually justify the European Union, to actually let us positively feel why it is actually a good thing to be part of the European Union? What is the added value of the European integration process? And I will do so by addressing 2 challenges and 1 chance. And I will start with the challenges, despite the title, because I would like to finish on a positive note. The 2 challenges I want to highlight is that while the member states have conferred very far-reaching powers on the European Union, concretely in trade, it has been extended to services, to intellectual property rights, to foreign direct investment. So whenever the European Union concludes a trade agreement with a third country, the Netherlands has very little to say. It could in principle be outvoted, and is outvoted. So we have put 1 point that is really centrally relevant for globalization in the hands of the European Union as a qualified majority vote. So basically every member state can be outvoted to decide on TTIP, to decide on CETA. And that is, of course, very, very powerful. And member states have done so to actually ensure their autonomy in a globalized world. In a world where we have, value chains across the globe, member states felt that they would be better represented. However, at the same time, this naturally means that national governments lose a certain amount of control. They cannot act themselves. So when in the Netherlands we vote on an association agreement with Ukraine, the question is, what are we voting on? Very little of that agreement, very little, because the absolute majority, let's say 95% of that agreement, are qualified majority vote and decided by the European Union. So the Dutch people cannot decide on it. And we have seen that because ultimately, with very little change and very little protocols, it has moved on. And whether or not that is good or bad, we can discuss at the very end. But that has happened. So member states have given great powers to the European Union, particularly in trade. At the same time, this is felt as a limitation of power because national governments have lost power. So the individual citizen identifying much more with their national government than with the European Union feel like they're powerless, feel like they cannot find representation on the international plane. So that's the first challenge. The first challenge is this tension. And the second challenge is that the European Union compensates a comparatively weak position internationally, because internationally it's seen as an international organization, by imposing additional constraints on the member states. So this leads to a situation where the European Union's external actions actually trigger additional integrative forces. So member states are called into line in many ways. We will look a bit more closely at that. Let me zoom in on the very first challenge I told you and tell you a bit more about that. So the regret, I will call it. The first challenge is the very recent high level of regret of member states. So first they confer powers, and then they disagree more and more and more and more passionately about how the European Union uses these powers after they have conferred it to the Union. And how shall I say that? This regret you find in very many different ways. You see pushback in political terms, member states not agreeing with the migration compact. You see an unprecedented number of disputes brought to the Court of Justice. Since 2009, we can really see a rise in member states challenging actions of the European Union. We see interinstitutional disputes, so situations where the Commission challenges the Council or the European Parliament challenges the Council. Situations where institutions that are comparatively more remote from the member states, so less under their control, such as the Commission and the Parliament, challenge actions by the body that is constituted by representatives of the member states, the Council. And what we also see is actions brought directly by member states challenging. What we see is requests for opinions. It's a particular procedure in the European Union where either a member state or an institution can, after an agreement has been negotiated but not yet signed and entered into force, so an envisaged international agreement, can challenge that agreement before the court. And all of this we see in unprecedented forms. So member states challenge politically, openly. They challenge the European External Action Service, but also they challenge in court. And that, of course, puts the Union against the member states and also creates a narrative of domination by the European Union. So, and I will only quote very few legal texts. But to quote Advocate General Cocotte, these legal actions are fought with astonishing passion on both sides. Allegations were made that on the one hand the Commission wished to do everything possible to prevent international action by the member states, and on the other hand the Council was compulsively looking for legal bases that always permit participation by the member states. And these are strong words. In legal texts, to speak of astonishing passion, to speak of compulsion, is exceptional. So it shows you that really the tone has changed. I've put some images of, regret, compulsion, and passion, even though there's usually in law not that much of that. So in short, member states have willingly and repeatedly conferred more powers to the European Union and at the same time felt regret when these powers are exercised. And this has led to a pushback, both politically and judicially, that we can really see, that we can trace, that we can touch. This is, you can empirically show this. The second challenge is that, and that is also an underlying, let's say, reason for why external relations are problematic, and that is because the Union is comparatively weak. It is not a primary actor. International law is really steeped in state sovereignty, so states are the ultimate actor under international law. The European Union is what we call a derivative actor, so it is treated like an international organization. And that creates additional tensions. And I couldn't refrain from showing you very quickly a book that I wrote recently, and that is actually where I make the whole argument that I will tell you today in 40 minutes on a concise 305 pages, in case you want to inquire further. So the Union has difficulties under international law for three reasons that I want you to take home. The first one is because it is so pluralist. It is the only construction with this level of international external objectives, for example, to promote international law, to promote welfare, to preserve the peace, like state objectives, going farther than many international state objectives. For example, in the Netherlands, you have very limited objectives of the Netherlands in the world in comparison to what the European Union puts out there in its treaties as what it wants to change in the world. But at the same time, it consists of so many different actors. You have the 28 member states and you have the Union, all of them having the power to conclude international agreements, all of them acting in principle in certain areas autonomously, in other areas together, and every member state, of course, pursuing their own foreign policy, for example, in security matters where the Union is much less strong. And this, of course, leads to a situation where, yeah, every time the Union exercises powers, you must decide, so who's competent? So different from a state where simply, let's say, the Dutch government decides, okay, in principle, we would like to cooperate in this and that way. I mean, obviously, they have to respect EU law now. But for the Union, the first question is, can the EU actually do this? As the Union can only act when it has been conferred powers. So every action is preceded by a question of who's competent. And this also means that competences are divided in an idiosyncratic manner, so in a manner that doesn't match reality. And that results in a situation where often the EU and the member states act all together, like in the Ukraine Association Agreement, like in TTIP, like in the past for all trade agreements. That has now changed, and I'm happy to discuss that in questions and answers, but in the past, member states were part of this. So that means that all 29 units that I just mentioned act together as one actor. You can imagine what that means in terms of negotiation that carry on for years of positions, but also as soon as the agreement is concluded, what does it mean for actually putting the agreement into practice? To avoid international state responsibility for not meeting the agreements that were made in that international agreement. So that requires a level of cooperation that is unmatched in states. So basically, what I want to say is when the Union acts internationally, it must reduce its own complexity. So in a way that is not the case for states. And that means that you have very strong, cooperation duties on the member states that go much farther than the cooperation obligations that you have internally. because in principle, when the Union and the member states act as one actor, or in a case where even the member states act on behalf of the Union, that we will discuss in a moment, what you have is that the position is determined by the Union in the Council, and everybody has to fall into place. So that is one problem. One problem of the Union is that it's so complex, and you need to reduce that complexity. The other point that I already mentioned is that the Union is in such a comparatively weak position. And that means that you have situations, and I just want to highlight one, where the Union can actually act itself. It cannot act in an international organization, in many of them, actually in most of them. So the more the world becomes legally connected as part of a result of globalization, the more is decided in international organization, international labor organization, anything. And in many of them, the Union cannot be a part, because the constitution, let's say, or the agreement that sets up that international organization only allows state parties. So what happens then? We have the member states acting on behalf of the Union, because they in principle don't have power in that particular area. So the member states determines in the background what they should do, and they act on behalf of the Union. But that makes it, again, more complicated. And in addition, what threatens the whole system internally is that, and that's an important point, that member states, as I said, they are they have more capacity as international actors. They can have the last word. Ultimately, the Union is penetrable, as we call it. So ultimately, you can hold member states responsible when the Union fails to meet its commitments. And that is also part of the power of the Union, of course, that you can hold the 28 member states ultimately responsible for that. But that also means that member states are more powerful. They have, under international law, powers that they are not allowed to exercise under EU law. But they can. So in principle, if they go and conclude whatever agreement with Brazil, or any other third state, the United States, it is binding under international law, despite the fact that it's a breach of EU law. So they could be taken to the Strasbourg court. They could be held responsible within the EU legal order. But they're bound under international law. And that also creates a tension, particularly in gray zones, obviously, where it's not clear who is competent. So member states can create, let's say, facts that are legal facts that are difficult to disregard. Finally, and I think that is an important part of this, so I wanted to give you 3 reasons why this second weakness of the European Union is such a challenge. Third countries are not bound by EU law. So when a member state goes out and enters into an international agreement that is in principle in breach with EU law, the third country will say, I don't care. This has nothing to do with our agreement. Our agreement establishes international obligations that I will hold you to. You agreed to this. You are a state. You had the capacity to do so. And that is above all because the primacy of EU law, so the fact that within the EU legal order, in principle, national courts are willing to disapply all other law in favor of EU law, doesn't apply to third countries, obviously. So in third countries, they would simply say, hey, I have concluded an international agreement with you. Please meet your obligations. And if you don't, I will hold you responsible. I don't care about your obligations towards the European Union, to put it simple. And within the European Union, this works because let's say the stakes of the member states are so closely interconnected. They have such an interest in making this work, because if it doesn't work, it simply means that it will be economically very disastrous. It must work. So they have an interest in the European Union and EU law work because it keeps an equal level playing field. Everyone needs to meet the product requirements that the EU sets. Everyone has to comply by the rules. And that's very important. So member states are usually not willing to challenge the system, at least not so hard. Even the UK, leaving the European Union, complied with Article 50 and continues to comply with it, continues to try to find a solution that happens within the EU legal framework. Then they didn't just say, you know, we are a sovereign state, so whatever. So that shows, in a sense, that member states are still willing, both governments and, of course, held in line by national courts because of primacy. So even if a government wanted to breach EU law, in principle, it is held by its own national courts in line with EU law, because EU law is directly applicable. So within the European, this works because everyone has an interest that it works, and because of the separation of powers between governments and courts. But third countries, as I said, are game changers. They are not bound by EU law, so they don't care. And then courts obviously don't care either. So neither the government nor the court cares. And we could see that in a sense in certain instances where the European Union tried to make third countries to comply with the particularities of the European Union, to respect it. An example is, I believe it was 2011, where the Union tried to get observer status first in the General Assembly of the United Nations. And it did so a bit unhandily, and people were offended and didn't like it so much. So third countries simply said, no, what? We don't have international organizations as observers. Ultimately, diplomatically, the Union made this possible, and now it does have that status. But you could see in the first reaction, no one wanted to hear about the particularities. And you could see that in other instances. For example, in the Lisbon Treaty, where we changed from the European Community to the European Union, some countries objected even to name tag changes. So in the United Nations, what changed is we said European Community before, and we sort of screwed down the name tag and put up European Union. And member states and third countries even objected to that, even though in essence, yeah, it's a name change, it's a succession if you like, but it was of course a different legal entity, and the question was so who's responsible for previous statements and whatever. There's a lot of legal questions attached to it. It's not just changing a name plan. So that is one of the core problems. Third countries don't play by the rules, and that's why they change the game in a sense. And to allow, as I said, the European Union to nonetheless function as one entity with these high-flying external objectives, they impose very strong EU loyalty obligations, and that triggers far-going integrative forces. So what the Union does is basically say, okay, here's our position, not just in the areas where we are competent, but this is our position sort of on any policy area, and EU loyalty obliges member states not to contradict that position, even if they have residual power. So even in areas where they actually hold national power, let's say security, they must first coordinate, inform. They have a lot of obligations. They can't just go out there and say, okay, it's national security. I just decide to whatever, deliver weapons to a conflict area. And that is stronger in external relations than internally. And that's what I sort of want to frame as the second challenge, and that is the EU is much weaker. It has very high-flying objectives, and the only way it can meet them is by imposing obligations that we can safely say member states did not fully think through when they gave these external powers to the European Union, because they assumed the Union would act in questions of trade, intellectual property rights, services, whatever, specific competences they gave to the Union. But what that triggers is also obligations in all other areas, in order not to contradict the position of the European Union. And I will zoom in on one particular case. I mean, I tried not to give you too many cases, but this is a very interesting case. It's a recent case. It's the OIV case, we call it, and it concerns the Union's position in the International Organization of Wine and Wine. And, well, the context doesn't matter so much. What we can say is that any decision taken in that context have repercussions for the competences of the European Union. So internally, the European Union sets the standard of what you can write on a bottle of wine, that it can trade freely within the European Union. So decisions in the International Organization for Wine and Wine have repercussions for internal rules of the European Union. So in this case, the Council decided on a position, and Germany, supported by 7 member states, and this is also a phenomenon that we see since 2009, and that is that you have large numbers of member states going to the Court of Justice. Not just one member state being unhappy, but usually joined, as the procedure allows, by, let's say, half the member states being unhappy about exactly that situation. So that also shows the pushback, let's say. So Germany challenged this. The decision was based on a new provision in the Lisbon Treaty, in which member states that actually codified something that existed for a long time, and that is that the Union, that member states can act on behalf of the Union. And the Council said, okay, member states have to pursue this council position in this organization. And Germany's argument was relatively straightforward. Well, the union is not party to the International Organization of Wine and Wine, so how can it adopt a position in a body that it's not part of the agreement? But the court didn't have any of it, said, okay, if you take a decision in that organization, it has repercussions for internal EU rules, so you must act on behalf of the union. And besides the regret that it shows, you know, the large number of member states, it also shows how far-reaching these powers are. I mean, in principle, member states never carried it out to this point, that in the between acting on behalf of the union, so a provision that allows the council to tell member states to pursue a specific point in a specific international organization, and the principle of EU loyalty, it in essence means even if the union was never part of the negotiation, it was never at the table, neither when the organization was set up, nor does it sit in the day-to-day bodies in that organization, member states will carry out EU policies in that body. So that shows a bit how far this goes. And it also shows that with the increasing judicial challenges, that issues are framed as, also to an extent in the press, but certainly in academia, as the union imposing these positions, and that feeds to an extent the us and them narrative of Brussels saying this is what we're doing and member states carrying it out only. These are the challenges, and that's complex and difficult to solve, but I want to take you to the chances, and I think that's very important also in the year 2019, where we vote for the European Parliament. And the chances of external relations is really the central plank of my argument, and that is that while citizens lose a certain amount of control through national governments when powers are conferred to the union, they gain democratic control as citizens, and in many areas, and that's the important point, they gain more control. So my central point is that the European Parliament is more powerful in international trade negotiations than any national parliament. And that means that your vote in May is actually for all these questions of TTIP, CETA, do we sell out, do we get chlorine chickens, do we have investor-state dispute settlements? That's the decisive vote. The decisive vote does not happen when you vote for the national elections. The decisive vote, for whatever party you want to vote, happens when you vote for the European Parliament. And I've explained what I mean by that, and I'm also happy to pursue that further. Let me first take a step back. When laws are adopted, let's say a law is adopted by the European Parliament, and the identical law is adopted by the national parliament. We can say, and please forgive me the shorthand of the European Parliament adopting laws. I'm aware that it's a complex structure, Council, Parliament, Commission. I'm just making it a bit simple. So the underlying forceful idea of self-rule, which might sound idealistic even in the national context, is that citizens are more willing to abide by the exact same law only because it is adopted by the national parliament. And that is simply because they identify stronger with their role as national citizens than they identify with their role as European citizens. And I would almost say that is probably the case even if the laws were not identical. But if the law was stronger to their disadvantage, the national law was stronger to their disadvantage than the law adopted by the European Parliament. And that is the core of the problem that you see. And I want to take this back to a construction that I borrow from Jürgen Habermas, a German philosopher that wrote a lot about the European Union and the question of democratic justification of the European Union, democratic control. And he uses the concept of divided sovereignty. And in his idea, each individual has two capacities, the capacity as a national citizen and the capacity as an EU citizen. And he also sort of traces this very concretely to representation through the council as a national citizen, representation through obviously the national governments, and representation as an EU citizen through the parliament, and to an extent through EU bodies. And I mean, we can discuss sort of the basis of this further, but what I want to say is the core argument of my talk is that when the that EU citizens are better represented when the EU agrees to these international trade agreements. So post-Lisbon, the European Parliament has increased its power, so not the Union, but the Parliament within the institutional structure, that it has to agree to the conclusion of every international agreement that would fall under the ordinary legislative procedure internally, and that's about 90% of all cases, certainly all economic questions. So all the trade agreements I spoke about. So no international agreement between the EU and a third country is concluded without the European Parliament saying ultimately aye, so saying ultimately yes to the agreement. And this is of course a veto form of power, yeah? It is, how shall I say that? It's at the very end. It is not the classic power of Parliament to form a deal, to shape a law, to discuss, to constructively amend. It is only at the very end. However, what it has managed to do is actually extend this power, to levy its power, to remind the other institutions beforehand, listen, if you don't agree, we will simply say no. And it has also shown its teeth. In 2009, it has rejected the SWIFT agreement, a core agreement that was concluded on the basis of transfer, or that regulated the transfer of European financial data to the US, and it simply said no, because it was available to US counterterrorism authorities, and the European Parliament rejected it. I mean, later it agreed after amendments, but that shows its power, yeah? And it also rejected in 2012 the anti-counterfeiting trade agreement, where that sets up international standards for intellectual property rights enforcement. So it has shown its teeth, it has said no. But besides saying no, I mean, it can't veto every time, obviously. That would undermine the EU as an international player, and it would create tensions between the institutions and so on. But it has learned to use its powers, and we can see other ways in which it exercises its powers. For example, in the context of TTIP, in the context of CETA, it has actually proposed building blocks of the investor-state dispute settlement mechanism that we now have. The not so much ad hoc, I don't know how much you follow that debate, but not ad hoc set up tribunals, but a permanent court is agreed with a possibility to appeal. So what leads ultimately to the multilateral investment court, ultimately to a sort of international court, the Parliament has actually given these building blocks in its comments on Commission action. So that shows, and the Commission has actually negotiated this in CETA. Huh? So that shows that Parliament actually is very successful behind the scenes to remind everyone, if you don't listen to me, and it actually literally does that. It does that in its resolutions. It says, listen, if you don't listen to me, I will not agree in the end. So besides the consent, it has also managed in practice to have a bearing on the negotiation, and quite a bearing. So that's one point that I wanted to make. And I mean, having said all this, we are now waiting in March 2019 on a decision of the court on whether or not CETA can actually stand in the investor-state dispute settlement agreement. So in the European Union, in many ways, the ultimate say often still lies with the court. So that on a side note. But what I want to say, and I think that is something you can make hard, is that the European Parliament is not sidelined in these negotiations. And that if you distinguish, as we often do in democratic legitimacy, between three different forms, the first being passive acceptance, and that is an argument often made, member states vest the European Union with democratic legitimacy because they accept the treaties. They don't challenge them, they don't change them. I mean, they change them occasionally, but on certain points they don't change them. So, for example, it is said primacy of EU law is accepted because member states have never changed the treaties to say no to primacy. That's, of course, a very weak form of acceptance. I mean, it's passive acceptance. Pretty much you live in the Netherlands, so you agree with all the laws. Well, certainly you don't, but it's very difficult to challenge them. And in the EU, it's similar. I mean, a treaty amendment procedure we have seen also in the rejection of the constitutional treaty is, of course, very difficult. The second form is consent. So this is what the European Parliament has. And that means at the end, you can say yes or no. You have no amending powers. You're not the decision maker. But at the end, your vote is needed, your, at least not objection is needed, the absence of a veto is needed for anything to move forward. And the third is, of course, the strongest form of authorship. That's what the usual Parliament has, to write actual laws, to write them in every detail. And my point is that the European Parliament has used its powers of consent, so the second strongest form of democratic legitimacy, in such a constructive and affirmative form that it is actually more powerful than the letter of the law would make you think when you read the treaties. And I've given you a couple of examples. In the European Union, but maybe that's a bit more a side note, this actually vests the European Union with a democratic legitimacy that it didn't have before. And before, the court claimed to an extent autonomy, primacy, but the court was very central in making the union work as it does and give it its autonomy, both internally and externally. And here now it is vested really with a democratic voice. But what I want to say is that it makes the European Parliament more powerful than national parliaments, and that point I haven't yet made. And that is because the European Parliament has a system that is comparable to the US presidential system. And that is very different from the absolute majority of national systems within the European Union. In question and answers we can look at the exceptions, but the absolute majority has a situation like in the Netherlands, where Parliament supports government and government relies on Parliament. So there's no opposition voice from Parliament. Even if the government negotiates an international agreement, it is more difficult for Parliament to challenge it. And I mean, I'm aware of the, I don't know, 20-something parties here. So the situation in the Netherlands might again be slightly exceptional. But in most countries, it's even reduced to very few parties. So where Parliament even more strongly supports positions of the government. And in the European Union, that's not the case. Majorities and political powers in the European Parliament have absolutely nothing to do with the Council. The Council that sets the negotiation mandate, and that's the other most powerful player, is entirely dominated by the member states. So if the government in any member state changes, Council composition changes throughout the 5 years. European Parliament, you vote every 5 years. Here we go, new composition, completely separate. Separate in a way that gives it freedom, autonomy, to challenge the Council, to disagree. And that is exceptional. And the combination of the two, the formal powers, the use and practice, and the possibility of Parliament to act autonomously, to act as an opposition, makes it so strong. I need to hurry up, so I will. Scarcity of time and resources are the same in all the parliaments, so I just want to draw attention to that. Not that I believe that, parliaments are excessively powerful in external relations. No, we can safely assume whenever policy making is externalized, parliaments lose power to the executive. That is a phenomenon in all contexts. So that plays here as it plays in national contexts. But what I want to say, and this is a bit the core of my thesis, giving more and more external relations to the Union is a constitutional moment for the Union. It can either enable citizens to feel that they take back control in a globalized world, because I completely think we cannot underestimate the relevance of international relations today. It determines every part of our life. Or it could lead to a situation of citizens even feeling that they lose more control because they give control to the Union. And the core question here is, do citizens continue to see the European Union as an extension of globalization? So removing control from national governments, from national parliaments? Or can they see it as something that enables them, even in a globalized world where we have no choice, that's simply how it is, has nothing to do with the European Union, to exercise, for example, in trade deals, power through the European Parliament? And yes, as I said, international relations in the 21st century, I think, is really the core to being still autonomous, to having still power. And I think the European Union does so far a relatively bad job. I don't say it doesn't at all. I mean, Juncker held its State of the Union, no one noticed except for European academics, to say it's the hour of union sovereignty. Yeah, using the S word is very powerful if the Union does. It doesn't do that very often. And of course Macron, and I suppose you haven't missed that since 2017, regularly speaks of the sovereignty of the Union. So some make an attempt. I'm not saying there's no attempt. But for example, in the elections to the European Parliament so far, I see very little of external relations. I see very little that MEPs actually make an argument on the basis of this is a power we hold and this is a power that's relevant and that's important. And protesting against TTIP is important, fine, I don't say it's not, but more important is that you go and vote for the European Parliament, whatever party you want to vote, possibly against trade deals, if that's your position, yeah. And it also means, and that is where I want to link it back to Brexit in the end, that yes, with Brexit, to an extent, the UK government has gained greater control over its trade relations, with all the limitations that has, because people are simply factually less interested in a 60 million people market than in a 500 million people market. That is a pure fact of, you know, economics. But individuals have lost power. They have lost power because the national parliament in the UK is less powerful to control these deals, so the government can do much more what it likes. And of course they have lost power because they're no longer part of this much bigger player that is simply listened to much extensively. And we have seen it in attempts of the UK to hop on to EU trade deals. Oh, this is supposed to have the arms up, but it doesn't matter. So that is one point that I want to really finish on, and that is while the government may have increased certain powers, which certainly will play out as that it can take its own decisions for 60 million people rather than participating in the decision for 500, individuals have lost power to the executive. And that's also one reason, or one reason behind why you can think why Brexit is still sort of muttering on as it does. And yeah, that's where I will leave it for the moment to give you some time for questions. I hope that you will challenge some of my positions.
Often when people want control or take power, they need a certain vision to keep that power or that momentum of taking control and power. And with America, United States, it's the American dream. With the Chinese, it's economic nationalism, and Russia also has their own kind of vision or culture. So what would be the binding vision of the European Union for people to maintain control or to want to take the power or give power to Brussels? What's the vision?
Yeah, that's a very good question. I think, well, first of all, I'm German, as you must have noticed by my accent, so we can't say that Angela Merkel has given us a lot of vision in the past. So maybe I'm more used to politics without vision. But I agree with you that that is something that binds people. It's what you would call, if you take a more philosophical approach, Rechtfertigungsnarrative, so a narrative to justify why we're all together. Yeah, why is this the aim? Why do we want this? And I think one could be actually control. That's what I'm proposing. Control in a globalized world. That in a globalized world, as any member state, and I'm taking the Netherlands because that's where we are, not because they are exceptional. It's a big difference whether you have a very small market of, I don't know, help me, 17 million, is that approximately right? Or if you are a big market, and economic, let's say economic ties with the rest of the world are of course not just economic. I mean, we decide on labor condition in these trade agreements. We decide on certain social conditions. We decide on product safety in these trade agreements. So in many ways, when I say trade agreement, it's actually yeah, almost an old-fashioned world. What we now call them is deep and comprehensive free trade agreements, but what it actually means is any area of life. And you could say, if you agree with my argument, that you would want to keep control about that as a citizen, as parliament. So I think that's one vision, that seeing the EU as an answer to globalization rather than an extension of globalization. But maybe that is too technical for a vision.
Maybe it's more management or more practical to have this European Union, but it's not real a binding vision of philosophy. Of insight, or like the United States or China.
I can see why you say that, but I think democratic control is to me more than technical. I mean, democratic legitimacy, the feeling of being determining your own fate in a globalized world, I think is the core of all the emotions surrounding Brexit, and I think it's very important to people. So I do think it taps into more than who manages. It taps into, can I still decide whether I eat chlorine chicken or not? Can I still decide certain things? Can I still, yeah, decide on my labor conditions to an extent? Can I still decide whether we import garments from Asia, despite the fact that this is child labor and unhealthy working conditions? So I think there's many elements that you could think that I at least believe that I as a citizen want to have control over them, and I find it very disconcerting to lose more and more control. So to me, but maybe that's of course my technical, legal, sort
Anyone
of
else?
professional distortion.
So about losing control, when you have 50 million people and you have 100% control over what you decide, or you have 16% control over 300 million people, I don't think you objectively lose control, right? You just have the same amount of power but now you have it secondhand in the European Union. So when you have an outspoken policy that you want to have, it's better to have 50 million people and 100% of the control.
The way you put it, I agree with you, but I don't think that's reality. Huh? I mean, look at globalization. People just don't want to agree to the UK conditions because the market is not interesting enough. I mean, trade negotiations are here. I give you 500 million people, and that's why you follow our product requirements. That's why it's impossible to produce a car anywhere in the vicinity of the European Union that doesn't meet the conditions that the European Union sets, because it's simply costly, ineffective to produce a car for whatever Switzerland that you couldn't, I don't know whether they actually produce any cars, but that you could sell on the EU market, yeah? So that is one aspect. One aspect is simply that gravity, no one cares about the UK market. The only reason why people don't agree to trade agreements with them yet is because they don't know whether they have access to the internal market. That's the first and only question. The 7 out of, I think, 20-something countries have agreed that the UK could carry on the conditions that have been negotiated with the EU. And it's all temporary. It could be revoked any time, and it depends on, do they offer access to the internal market? And that means that in the world, certainly your weight is completely different. So 16% of 500 million is very different because 500 million is so different, yeah. Yeah, I seriously doubt that, because if China sets the conditions, that doesn't increase your autonomy. I think if we agree that sovereignty is in essence autonomy, we must understand that in today's world, that autonomy of a member state, we are not in the 19th century trade any longer. So that means that value chains also don't mean we import a product from China, but it means, you know, product goes everywhere across Europe and abroad, and then it comes and is assembled somewhere, and then it goes somewhere else, and here somewhere else. And all these things need to be, of course, agreed, otherwise they don't run smoothly. And being powerful in that context gives you more autonomy. So I can see your point, why you say, the UK being 16% or whatever of the larger whole, that is more limited. But I think ultimately it doesn't pay off that way for individuals. Huh? I think national governments might seemingly have more control, and I think to an extent the jury is still out what the UK will get in trade deals, for example. And I'm really focusing on trade. Yeah? I mean, if we talk about security and similar issues, the UK is of course also much more powerful. Huh? Let's not kid ourselves. For us losing the UK as a military power within Europe, that's not 16%. So in many ways there you can possibly make slightly different arguments. But the dependence on each other, I mean, think about data flows, questions of for example, data protection. The court has several times said we can't export data to the US because they don't meet our data protection standards. We have now a new case pending for commercial data, whether that's possible. These things are only listened to because the EU is such a big market. And the UK, to an extent, we don't know yet what's going to happen. Either they follow our data protection rules, but then we have a big problem on moving data forward to the US. They must in principle say that they don't, which they will probably not. So, and then possibly I mean, data really is the new oil, yeah? So in so many ways, you anyway dependent on the rules of other people. The question is only how much leverage do you have to impose your rules rather than following the rules of the others. So, I mean, I can see your point. That's how I started, and that's also how I want to finish. But I think in the complexity of today's world, it is not that simple.
One very last question, because we have to leave.
Sorry.
I can try to be shorter, sorry.
Great discussion, thank you. My first question is some of the challenges, issues you raised in your research. why aren't they issues in the United States? I find US states to be far more idiosyncratic compared to many European states. Why isn't it that in New York we don't worry about our tax money go to Alabama or even further to NATO? In fact, we think we should be paying for NATO. That's the majority of what Americans feel. So why are these issues in Europe? I'm really interested to know. And then the second thing, your comment about how people are willing to accept the same law, if it's a national law, compared to EU law. Isn't that an argument that the idea behind EU is philosophically flawed? That's where the continent is. They want to be national countries. And that's the way it should be.
Well, many elements. Let me start from the end. I agree. The point that people would much rather accept their national law, even if it's more detrimental to them than the EU law, is a problem. It's a problem that Europe fights with. I don't know whether it should be that way because of that. Because I also think, if you look at Brexit, I think there's widespread agreement that there was a lot of disinformation. So the question of whether people have really exercised their will in a sense of understanding, I think is largely questioned. And I think you should give people a choice. So my point is that the European Union should do a much better job in explaining what I tried to just explain, to justify, and possibly people might feel differently in certain regards. Yeah, maybe they actually feel that they would want to empower the European Union to say, no, we don't want chlorine chicken or whatever. And that is a bit part of my argument. So should be, I don't want to speak to. I think should be a autonomous democratic choice that many people do not or cannot make in these circumstances. So I think there's a lot of justification problematic. There's a lot of misinformation. There's a lot of problems that I think should work differently. Why does the US not have the same problems? Because it's a state. Ultimately, the US is well, everything I spoke about is external relations, and the US is the state. If we hold someone state liability, if we hold someone responsible, the final answer point is Washington. No one cares about New York in external relations in these terms. When we negotiate TTIP, we don't negotiate with New York. So that's the difference in external relations. Internally, I agree. The US is very complex, and the US states also have a lot of power as compared to the federation. That is true. But in external relations, it's one state. That's the black box that international law deals with. While in the European Union, you have 28 black boxes, which for a large part of their external relations choose to be one. You don't even have 29 black boxes. Huh? There's 28 member states, and ultimately under international law, they are the only primary actors. The question is, can they agree to work together towards an end? And why do people not care about transferring money from New York to Alabama? Yeah, that's a question more of identity. That goes, I think, much further than what I was speaking about today. But part of it, maybe, to an extent.
Thank you, Christina, for your lecture. Thank you for coming. And check our website for other EU programs in March, April, and May. See you. Bye.